Hello, I'm Edgar Munhall, the Curator Emeritus of the Frick Collection, and I'm here today with you in the Oval Room of the Frick Collection to discuss one portrait in the exhibition, Pastels, Prints, and Portraits, Whistler in the Frick Collection, which will be on view here until August 23, 2009. Many visitors pass by this portrait by Whistler without paying much attention to it. Largely, I suspect, because of its minimalism, its very simple monochromatic palette, and the fact that there's not much on the canvas except a rather ghostly image of a tall young man. But in fact, it is that minimalism that makes the picture so extraordinary, as we'll find out this afternoon. Whistler had been painting portraits throughout his career, but when he came to the subject of this one, Comte Robert de Montesquiou-Fezensac, he had a very special subject indeed. Robert, as I think we may presume to call him, which he would never have permitted while alive, was a great French aristocrat whose family origins go back to the 7th century, to Merovingian times. He was very proud of this aristocratic heritage, and although he didn't have much money, he was able to impose himself on Parisian society because of his very history and the extraordinary nature of his personality. He was a poet, a prolific, if not very gifted poet, an art critic, a social critic, a giver of parties that were renowned throughout Europe at the time, and a writer of considerable means, including an extraordinary series of memoirs that he left at the time of his death. Considering Montesquieu's celebrity, the press regularly described and illustrated his receptions. It is not surprising that allusions to him occurred in the literature of his day. It began with Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers of 1844, in which the character d'Artagnan was based on one of his ancestors. Then came the weird Esthe des Esseintes in Huysmans' Au Rebours of 1884, whose over-refined attitudes and decor recalled aspects of Robert's first apartment in Paris. Then, many literary historians believe that the central figure of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray of 1890 was inspired by Montesquieu. But it was Marcel Proust, a longtime friend whose portrait Robert once drew, who immortalized Montesquieu as the Baron de Charlus in his novel À la recherche du temps perdu, essentially outing him in this demonic homosexual character, sometimes frightening with his sadomasochistic habits, ultimately tragic in his aging decline. Robert, like many of his contemporaries, recognized himself as the butt of this savage caricature and deeply resented it. He came to meet Whistler in 1885 through the American artist John Singer Sargent, who sent a letter to Henry James in London announcing the arrival of Montesquieu and suggesting that James introduce him to Whistler. So here at the very beginning, we have an extraordinary cast of characters: Sargent, Whistler, Henry James, and Robert de Montesquieu. Whistler and Montesquieu got along very well, and as Whistler was tending to spend more and more time in Paris, he realized that the friendship with Montesquieu could serve him very well, introducing him to the higher ranks of Parisian society and to the advanced circles of the Parisian art world. And so the two struck up a close friendship, which finally culminated in Montesquieu's proposing to Whistler that he paint his portrait in 1891. The execution of this work, a life-size image of Robert de Montesquieu, went on for 2 years, beginning in Whistler's studio in London, continuing in a studio he was renting in Paris, and ending up in the studio of which we'll see an image in the Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs in Montparnasse in Paris. After the portrait was finished in 1892, Whistler kept it in his studio, refusing to give it up to Montesquieu until the time of the great exhibition of 1894 came around, and Whistler decided it was time to let the portrait be seen by the general public. It was acclaimed with great enthusiasm. Montesquieu was finally able to take it home, and he paid Whistler not the usual princely sum that Whistler was able to request by that time, but by giving him an Empire bed, of which we have an image. This bed, Montesquieu told Whistler, had come down from Napoleon himself, for in fact, Montesquieu's great-great-grandmother had been the governess to the son of Napoleon, the Prince de Rome. And so there is a possibility of this distinguished heritage. In any case, Whistler claimed to be delighted with this payment. But some years later, when Montesquieu sold the portrait for 64,000 francs, Whistler was outraged because, as he wrote to Montesquieu, "And so the portrait acquired as a poet for a song is sold again as the Jew of the Rue Lafitte for 10 times that song. Congratulations." This anti-Semitic reference to the Rothschilds was typical of Whistler's attitude. All this was occurring during the Dreyfus case going on in France. Montesquieu never responded fully to this insulting letter from Whistler, but the portrait went on its way, purchased by an American, Canfield, who then sold it the year of his death to the Knoedler Gallery, who then sold it directly to Henry Clay Frick. And so the portrait entered Mr. Frick's collection in 1914. As such, it was the most modern painting in his collection. Whistler had been dead barely 10 years when the portrait was sold. Montesquieu was still alive. He outlived Mr. Frick by 2 years. But it's highly unlikely that Mr. Frick ever encountered Montesquieu, although his wife and his Francophile daughter, Helen, probably attended lectures that Montesquieu gave in New York in 1903. The picture has several extraordinary qualities. One, that shows Montesquieu, as I said, life-size, in evening dress, with a thin, very thin cane called a badine that he carried in the evening, and a gray garment over his left arm. This garment turns out to be a chinchilla cape, which belonged to Montesquieu's cousin, the Comtesse Greffule. She was the queen of Parisian society at the time. Montesquieu was essentially her mentor, leading her through the art world, the musical world, the world of society at the time. The two were inseparable. And somehow the two conceived the idea of introducing her presence into the portrait by the presence of this chinchilla cape. When the portrait was exhibited in 1894, Whistler simply entitled it Noir et Or, Black and Gold, Portrait of Count Robert de Montesquiou-Fezensac. And this title has often perplexed people who ask, where's the gold? Because there is, in fact, no gold in the portrait whatsoever. But I finally concluded, after studying this portrait for many years, that the gold is, of course, the frame itself, because Whistler often worked on paintings in their frames. And so the gold is the frame itself, whereas Whistler once was taught as a young man, the frame is the window through which the artist sees the subject of the portrait. The portrait was painted in some 100 sessions, according to Montesquieu, 60 according to Whistler, at twilight. And over again, Whistler would scrape off the paint, wipe it off, sometimes use a razor to remove the paint, and then start all over again. But it ends up being painted as thinly as a watercolor. It's almost a diaphanous breath of smoke applied or attached to the canvas. And this was the quality that fascinated people when they saw it in 1894. They regarded it as an apparition, as a strange, mysterious appearance coming through the dark of this man, Robert de Montesquieu. Montesquieu bridled at these endless posing sessions, but one day Whistler said to him, "Look at me for one moment longer and you will look forever." In other words, guaranteeing him what he wanted most of all, immortality, which he really did achieve through this portrait. As Whistler grew older, his paintings got simpler and simpler, and this painting belongs to a series of what we call the black portraits, in which there wasn't much on the canvas except a kind of shaky apparition of the subject. And one critic, the American artist Kenyon Cox, in 1902, in other words, the year before Whistler's death, wrote of his work, Whistler's early pictures are Whistlerian arrangements plus representation. His later are nearly pure arrangements with representation reduced to a vestige. A step further, and we should have line and color entirely for their own sake, with no representative value whatsoever. Should this step be taken, the result might, conceivably, be exquisitely beautiful, but it would be something else than what the world has hitherto known as the art of painting. Well, that step was taken not many years after this portrait was finished, and indeed the whole history of modern art in the 20th century depends a great deal on this image that Whistler painted. Portraits, Pastels, Prints, Whistler in the Frick collection will be on view through August 23rd. For more information about it and the other works of art in the show, please visit our website at frick.org.